Okay.
Oh, it's nice out there.
Oh, you noticed? Yes. Yes. We had the floor resurfaced just this week. Actually, it was yesterday and Monday, and no, it looks very sharp.
That's really looks great.
It got rid of all those little stains and
Right.
bits and bobs and such. So.
And the, looks clean.
It was, absolutely. Now we have to keep it that way. Be careful with your coffee when you're walking down the sidewalk. All right, let's begin with a question for you, not for me. Who was the first Jew?
We must be wrong, because that's the obvious.
Well, let's take a look at where Abraham fits in the timeline. Who's the first person that we meet in the entire Torah?
Adam.
All right, so we got Adam, and between Adam and somebody, there's going to be 10 generations, and then to Abraham, there's going to be 10 generations. Who's in between them?
Noah.
Noah. There we go, Noah. All right, so Adam to Noah is 10 generations. Noah to Abraham is 10 generations, so this seems pretty significant. But was Abraham a Jew? Not to begin with. He certainly wasn't born a Jew, as we're going to see. He definitely was not born to the Jewish faith. But what does it mean to be a Jew?
To be born into it? No.
Well, no, because people can convert. We know that. There's nothing unusual about the idea that someone could become a Jew. But what does it mean when someone is a Jew?
To believe in God.
To believe in God.
One God.
To believe in one God.
One God.
Do you have to be Jewish to believe in one God?
No.
No, it helps. But it's not the only way to serve God. We know explicitly within Jewish ideas that there can be millions, billions of other people, God willing, who will recognize God as God and who will worship and serve God in their ways, but will not be Jewish. So just because Abraham believed in one God wouldn't make him Jewish. That's not enough. It's minimum, but it's not enough. Circumcised, he wasn't circumcised when he was younger, but he was circumcised when he was older, absolutely. That's another one of those mitzvot that is part of being Jewish. Although technically, even if someone wasn't circumcised, if they were born Jewish, they still are Jewish. They just are delayed in fulfilling that commandment.
Know the law.
What's that?
Know the law.
Know the law. Well, what do we call the law generally? The book, the Torah. When did we get the Torah? Did we get the Torah here?
No. Moses.
Moses, and more specifically,
The end of his life.
well, more specifically, the whole nation at Sinai. Exactly. Remember, Moses did not get the Torah by himself. The idea was that the Torah was given to all of us collectively. Moses was the vehicle of transmission, but it wasn't his private property. It was given to the whole nation. Well, if the Torah happened here, we'll just call that Torah time, and Abraham happened here, and if Torah is part of what it is to be a Jew, was Abraham a Jew?
Well, God spoke to him and told him what to do.
God spoke to him and told him what to do, but God spoke to Noah. Was Noah a Jew? God spoke to Adam.
But Isaac.
What's that?
Isaac.
Well, Isaac and Jacob and Jacob's children and their children, they still lived before the Torah. Now, there is a principle within Jewish midrashim that says that all of the patriarchs from Abraham down kept Torah. But they don't go so far as to say that they were actually Jewish. And there's a couple reasons for that. Remember, if you say that Abraham is Jewish, and by extension that Sarah, his wife, was Jewish, then that means that Ishmael was Jewish. And all of Ishmael's descendants then. It means that Esau was Jewish. And clearly our tradition does not believe either Ishmael or Esau and their nations to be inherently Jewish. If they'd like to become Jewish, that's a wonderful thing, but they're not there from the start. It's only from the time of Torah, from Moses and the nation at Mount Sinai onward that we talk about Jews. Which brings us back to the real question. Why did we... Torah's here, and we said Torah was the reason for existence. Why did we have to wait all this time to get Torah? God could have given Torah to Adam. God could have given Torah to Noah. God could have given Torah to Abraham. Potentially.
Maybe he wanted to wait till they reached the promised land.
But we didn't get the Torah at Israel. We got the Torah 40 years before we went to Israel. I mean, specifically, we didn't get Torah in Israel.
Getting back to your question, and we have to say that Moshe wasn't born a Jew. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Correct. None of them were born under the category, the technical, legal definition of what it is to be a Jew. And they all become Jews as they accept the covenant at Mount Sinai. They were what we would call Israelites prior to that. That is to say, they were the generic category of belonging to the family descended from the sons of Jacob, but they had not accepted Torah yet. They had accepted God, but they hadn't accepted Torah because it hadn't been given. So it wasn't that they rejected it, it just hadn't been offered yet.
Well, it was there, but it just wasn't written down. It was being lived.
Well, it doesn't say that it was being lived in the Torah itself. But that leaves us all the way back to this other question then of, okay, if Abraham wasn't the first Jew, there is something that makes him different from Adam and Noah, who were the fathers of the entire world according to the Torah. And that's that God made a very specific covenant with Abraham, right? A very specific promise that we are going to look at. And that promise then is inherited not by initially all the children, but only by part of the children until we get to here where it becomes the national inheritance. And on top of that promise, we get the addition of Torah.
And that begs the question, did they speak Hebrew?
Well, we don't have any evidence they didn't speak Hebrew. That's to say, there's no reason to believe they didn't. But exactly what the Hebrew sounded like or was like, we don't know for sure. And you know, we're not sure exactly if we were standing in the room listening to them talk, if a modern Hebrew speaker would understand it. But for that matter, if someone was to travel back to Geoffrey Chaucer's day and stand there while he was reading from Canterbury Tales, I don't think anybody in this room, I'm guessing, would be able to understand his English. So it's hard to understand exactly what was and was not different between his dialect, his practice, and such. All we have to go on is the Torah, which was written in a language that we do understand. So we're left, though, with a very big question of, okay, Abraham wasn't the first Jew, but he was obviously the beginner of a very particular covenant, a very particular promise. Why? Why did God pick him? After 20 generations, God suddenly picked somebody to begin a new covenant, a new special relationship between him and his family that's going to ultimately culminate, be capped off with the giving of Torah and the transformation of his family into a nation that is going to carry a very special responsibility and gift for the rest of eternity.
Leaving in not idols.
Well, what does the Torah say? So, what does the Torah say about Abraham and why he was picked? Let's take a look at the Torah. Oh, did you want to?
I think maybe because when he ordered him to sacrifice his son, and he went about it as if he were going to do it, and then God said, no, it's not necessary, but the fact that you believed in me, that made him a good enough man.
So the Akedah, the almost sacrifice of Isaac, is an incredibly important part of Abraham's faith and an establishment of his character, but it comes after God already made the covenant, not before. What could Abraham have done to have earned this covenant that would continue? Okay, we're going to look at the Torah first, and then we're going to explore other answers, okay? All right, so Torah first. Now, unusually, we're actually going to start at the end of last week's parashah, because that's where the character, the name Abraham, gets introduced. So we're on page 62. And actually, it just begins at the very end, of 61, where it talks about this guy named Terach. And it says, when Terach had lived 70 years, he begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, this is the line of Terach. Terach begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran begot Lot. And Haran died in the lifetime of his father Terach in his native land in Ur Kasdim, in Ur of the Chaldeans, as it is referred to. And Abram and Nahor took to themselves wives, the name of Abraham's wife being Sarai, and that of Nahor's wife being Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, she had no child. Okay, just realized that the power cord is not plugged in, so I don't want the computer to die. There we go. Anything special so far about this guy, Avram, who will later be renamed as Avraham? Anything that sets him apart differently than the whole chain of people that were just being described between Noah and him?
Does it mean that he's the firstborn here? Abraham, where it says Abraham, Noah, Haran? Is that right?
Typically, yes. The firstborn is typically listed first.
Okay.
Now, we don't have a guarantee of that just from the text, but that is the usual pattern. We see with Ephraim and Manasseh later, they get a little confused. But generally speaking, yeah, the firstborn is usually listed first. Nothing special about this kid so far, yeah? No? And Terach took his son Avram, his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, and the wife of his son Avram, and they set out together from Ur of the Chaldeans for the land of Canaan. But when they had come as far as Haran, they settled there. And the days of Terach came to 205 years, and Terach died in Haran. Anything special about Abraham yet? No? Okay, well, let's see what happens in the first. Well, it's going to be something special then in the first verse of our Torah portion, right? Because he's going to get this special relationship with God. Page 69. This is chapter 12.
So we could see a miracle starting there. We know there's a miracle going to happen because Sarah was there.
Yeah, usually, and actually, now that you mention it, I can't think of a single example where a woman is described as being barren, where she doesn't end up with a kid by the end of the story. It's sort of like an automatic foreshadowing. If the Torah bothers to mention her fertility status, she's gonna have a kid. It's almost automatic. Okay, so who'd like to take over from Lech L'cha now that we're in our proper parashah of the week?
The Lord said to Abraham, go forth.
There's only one line on that page, yeah. Go forth.
From your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves to you.
Keep going.
Abraham went forth as the Lord had commanded him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abraham took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the wealth that they had amassed, and the persons that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in the land of Canaan, Abraham passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem, the cherubim of Moreh.
And just a couple more verses on the next page.
The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, I will assign this land to your offspring. And he built an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him. And there he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east,
And he built there an altar to the Lord, and he wrote to the Lord by name. And Avram journeyed by stages towards the Negev.
Okay. What great deed did Avram, later to be called Abraham, do to get this blessing? Well, what is the blessing? Oh,
He builds an altar to the Lord.
well, he builds an altar, but does he build the altar before God gives him this promise or after? After.
This is funny, I heard that because Abraham's father was idol.
Hold on a second. Before we get to stories, what does the Torah say? What's that?
He did nothing.
Nothing? Wait a minute.
He listened.
He listened?
He didn't.
But why did
It
God?
says,
Wait. So, well, let's just make the question here. He listened, because I mean it's good. I mean, he does what God says, but God talks to him first. Does that mean that God was talking to everybody in all of humanity, and just one guy actually listened? Was God, simultaneously sending out form letters to everybody in humanity saying, "Congratulations, Mr. So-and-so. You have won a chance to inherit the new land and receive a blessing, and I will make a great nation of you if you but listen to this letter." And everyone else threw it in the trash, and Abraham's the only one who picked it up and actually went.
It
Is
says
that?
The Lord appeared to Abraham.
Well, but why? Why did Avram merit this encounter with God, this promise of God? I mean, remember, he is now becoming chosen to be the father of nations, multiple nations, and specifically for our purposes, to be the father of a family line that will culminate in God's greatest gift to the world, Torah. The reason, according to our understanding, of why all of the creation was begun was that the Torah could eventually be brought into it. And we have no information about what Avram might have done to merit being the vehicle for this new lineage.
The verse says that he built there an altar to the Lord and he invoked the Lord by name.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that he honored God by calling by his name.
Avram certainly honors God, and he certainly does what God asks him to do, and he certainly stands up for God's principles, and he certainly is willing, Sally pointed out, to sacrifice his own son when God asks him to. But all of that happens after the promise comes. It's a little unusual. I mean, usually you would think if someone says, "I'm going to give you $1 billion so you can begin a new foundation which is going to revolutionize morality and faith in the entire planet," you would think that they wouldn't be picking the CEO of this new charitable foundation at random, that you would have to have earned it. What's on your resume that warrants you being chosen to have this job? Not, did you do a good job once you were picked, but weren't there other applicants? I mean,
Why him?
Why him? Why him? And why doesn't the Torah bother to tell us why? Okay? It's not just a question of why him. We're going to look at some different midrashim which give us ideas of why. But I want to also keep in the back of our mind for the end of our discussion, or as we go through, why didn't the Torah bother to tell us anything like what we're going to read from our midrashim? Okay, so let's go ahead and get to our midrashim. We're going to see some things that might look familiar. We're going to see some things that maybe aren't. You're welcome. But remember, everything that we are reading on this page does not appear in the Torah. Okay, the parts that we read in the Torah about Abraham's beginning are really, really short, and not what most people would call the foundation of a great novel. It's not building up his youth or his adolescence or his young adulthood into some great pioneer for God's future. It's just, there was this guy, he got married, his father moved, but they only got so far, and that was it. Well, thanks for the detail. So let's go ahead and see what detail the sages added from the Midrashim. Who'd like to read a little Midrash for us? Remember again, this is Midrash. This is rabbinic attempt to fill in the gap based upon the traditions that they had received from their teachers or based upon their own insights into the text itself.
On the night when he was born, Terah's
The he here being Abraham.
Terah's friends, among whom were
Counselors.
Counselors.
Sorry, it's the British spelling, I think.
Okay. And soothsayers of Nimrod were feasting at his house, and on leaving late at night, they observed a star, which swallowed up 4 other stars from the 4 sides of the heavens. They ran to Nimrod and said, "A lad has been born who is destined to conquer this world and the next. Now, then, give his parents as large a sum of money as they wish for the child, and then kill him."
Okay. What do we got here?
They were
A
frightened.
special child.
They were
A special child has been born, right?
And they were worried that he would not be good for the world.
Well, he was worried they were worried he wasn't going to be good for Nimrod. And let's remember, Nimrod is considered both by the Midrash and generally, not that there's a lot of detail about him in the Torah, but he's not exactly the most auspicious figure. And certainly by the time of the Midrashim, Nimrod is a byword for tyrant, dictator, and antagonist of God. So when the soothsayers see this sign in the heavens, and they interpret it to mean that a child has been born that is going to conquer the world and the next, they run to Nimrod knowing that such a child would be his adversary. And therefore, find him and kill him. Make sense? Okay? Don't you think that's the kind of thing the Torah should have bothered to tell us? You know, rather than just, and Terach was so-and-so, 70 years old. Shouldn't the Torah have told us, did you know on the night that Abraham was born, that there was a star in the sky and that everybody knew this was a child destined to change the world? Not, he was one more in a list of brothers. But there's something special here.
But if this wasn't in the Torah, how do we know that it happened?
We don't. We know that some of our sages taught this about Abraham's birth. We don't even know necessarily whether the sages who taught it were teaching it as a literal narrative truth or were trying to teach it as a spiritual truth. Unfortunately, they didn't write in different colored inks so we could tell the difference, which would have saved a lot of arguments in modern time. But we do know that they believed that there was truth in what they were teaching about Abraham's beginnings, and that none of it was actually recorded in the Torah.
But if it's Midrash, doesn't it need a hook?
Well, we're going to find the ultimate hook at the very, very end.
Okay.
But sometimes Midrashim most of the time Midrashim will use a hook in terms of a verse, something in the way the text is written that stands out. But sometimes the Midrash will simply come for the reason that we are sitting here going, there's got to be a reason. That it can be just the way the Torah was written itself, not a strange wording, not a strange phrase, not an unusual grammar structure. That's used a lot. I mean, those are often hooks for Midrash, but sometimes it's just, there's got to be more. And this is their attempt, at least one set of attempts.
But this is also considered the oral law, right?
So the status of the Midrash as being the oral law when it comes to Midrash Agadah, that is to say Midrash that is narrative or Midrash that is interpretive, as opposed to Midrash Halacha, which is legal Midrash, is that there can be multiple conflicting Midrashim, multiple conflicting explanations of the same circumstances. And none of them are considered more privileged than the other as being the truth. So unlike halacha, where we have to find the answer so that we know what to do, when it comes to Agadah, to the narrative interpretation, there can be multiple conflicting versions even within the ancient world, let alone within modern interpretations. Does that make sense? Maybe?
The wonder is that all this was recorded, that all these people had different opinions or different interpretation, and that it was recorded for future generations to read.
And not only was it surprising that it was recorded, but it's surprising that somebody recorded different opinions, rather than going through and saying, well, I'm just going to write down my favorites.
Yes.
They wrote down lots of opinions, including ones that didn't agree with each other. And yes, we should recognize this not just as a blessing, but perhaps a miracle that we
Isn't that
still
right?
have this information.
Isn't that unusual?
It's unprecedented and rarely repeated.
I didn't think, there aren't too many religions that give different versions of how. that-
Not like this. Not like this. And certainly not for a character like Abraham, given the centrality of the whole drama of our nation.
I just wanted to go back for a second. I misspoke. I was thinking about Mishnah.
Oh, you were thinking about Mishnah. Gotcha, yeah.
No.
Although even in Mishnah, that's another whole conversation. But even within Mishnah, there's multiple opinions, and then we have to discuss how is it that the halachic opinions from the oral Torah came to be varied. But that's another conversation. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue this story, this particular midrash of Abraham's birth. Sally, I think you were reading.
Okay. But Terah, who was present, said, "Your advice reminds me of the mule to whom a man said, 'I will give you a house full of barley if you will allow me to cut off your head.' Whereupon the mule replied, 'Fool that you are, of what use will the barley be to me if you cut off my head? Thus I say to you, if you slay the son, who will inherit the money you give to the parents?'"
All right, so Terah, regardless of what we're going to say in later midrashim, does stand out already as being a fairly clever sort of guy. Because where all the other counselors were saying, go find where this kid was born, buy him and kill him, he's saying you're not going to be able to buy the kid from his family, because what good is money to a family if they don't have children to inherit it? Nowadays, I suppose there are lots of people who say, I'm spending my grandchildren's inheritance, and they say it with joy. But back then, at least, there was a notion that what you were doing, at least a major part of the purpose of what you were doing, was so that you could build up future generations, not just yourself. So, yeah, Terah doesn't seem to think that's a very successful idea, and that makes him suspicious.
Then the rest of the counselors said, "From thy words we perceive that a son has been born to you." "Yes," said Terah, "a son has been born to me, but he is dead."
Which means he's a good liar.
Terah then went home and hid his son in a cave for 3 years.
Okay, so Abraham got to grow up in a cave for 3 years while the heat died down on trying to find this kid that was foretold by the star. Make sense? Maybe? Okay, continue the story.
When on coming out of the cave, Abraham saw the sun rising in all its glory in the east. He said to himself, "Surely this is the Lord of the universe, and I will worship it."
All right, pause. Abraham finally comes out of his cave after 3 years. 3 years. He's a 3-year-old, a little bit shorter than maybe my Nathaniel, right? And he walks out and he sees the sun coming up in the east. And what's his reaction?
Worshiping God.
What's that?
Worship God.
That this is God. This sun must be God. I mean, after all, you're living in a cave 3 years. This giant ball of light, that's a pretty impressive thing. But there's a step that you're overlooking. He's 3 years old. Well, that's part of the idea of infants having, or very small children having an ability beyond the rest of us is a very common motif and a very important one, as we'll discuss a little bit later. But how about the fact that he came out of this cave believing there is a God? And now all he's doing is trying to identify it. I mean, after all, there's no reason why he should look at the sun and believe it's God unless he believes something is God. And this must be it.
The amazing thing is that he don't have previous knowledge of him.
He does not have any previous knowledge of God, because we know that this particular time God wasn't popular, to say the least. So it seems rather miraculous that this child would have an intuitive grasp that there is such a thing as God, and then what he is doing is grasping around, searching, trying to figure out what God is. And the first thing that he comes to is the sun. I mean, is there anything more impressive, amazing, and important to the world than the sun? So that's his first object of worship.
But the evening came, and lo, the sun set, and night befell him.
So wait a minute. If the sun goes away, then it can't be God, right? Just, I mean, where'd it go?
And seeing the moon with her silver radiance, he said, "This then is the Lord of the world, and all the stars are its servants. To it I will kneel."
I mean, after all, the moon just pushed the sun out of the way. And when the moon comes out, it's got a bunch of stars with it. And again, if you've never spent time in an area that isn't corrupted by pollution and light at night, you would understand why people in the ancient world worship stars. The starry night is an amazing thing to see when you don't have too much pollution or light pollution. And he sees that come out in all of its glory and says, well, it drove the sun out of the sky. Remember, this is his first day seeing the cycle of day and night. And this moon is beautiful, and the stars are clearly its servants. That must be the true God of everything. But
The following morning, when moon and stars had disappeared, and the sun had risen anew, Abraham said, "Now I know that neither the one nor the other is the Lord of the world, but he who controls both as his servants is the creator and ruler of the whole world."
so what's his epiphany? What's his revelation?
He understood that neither one is God, but the one who controls them.
But the one who controls them, because what is it about them that makes him think there must be something controlling them?
Because they never go.
Right, day and night. There's a cycle here. There's a rhythm. There's a pattern. He's saying, wait a minute. The world was put together in a way that makes sense. And these beautiful things in the world are beautiful, but they don't control the world. They're part of it just like me. But there must be something bigger than the world, something behind the universe that made it all, and made it all with such perfect precision. That must be God. So this is his own steps of personal reflection to come to the ultimate realization that nothing in the world could be God, but instead God must be beyond the world.
Isn't this kind of far-fetched, Rich?
You've never talked with Nathaniel, but we might consider it to be stretching our credulity a bit on the types of philosophical reflection that a 3-year-old might make.
But they're making a point.
Well, they're making a point, but let's take it for a broader view. If you were going to imagine somebody worthy of all of this, wouldn't you imagine that even from a child at a very young age, that they were a religious prodigy?
Well, his parents must have talked about God in the first 3 years so that he would know that concept.
Well, let's meet his parents. Shall we continue?
Okay. Forthwith, Abraham asked his father, "Who created heaven and earth?"
So he figured out there must be a creator because of what he's observed in the world. So he goes to his dad. "Daddy, who made everything?"
Terah, pointing to one of his idols, replied, "This great image is our God." "Then let me bring a sacrifice to him," said Abraham. And he ordered a cake of fine flour to be baked and offered it to the idol.
Okay, so notice again, instinctually he understands that having identified God, that he has an obligation to serve God and to offer up a gift to God in gratitude, celebration, whatever you want to call it. So he already has this instinctual feeling of how to respond to divinity, but he's still trying to figure out what is God. And his father answers as his father knows, which is the idol did it. Right? Which of course we as Jewish readers would say, of course not. Of course not. But nevertheless, 3-year-old Abraham, who was able to figure out everything else up to this point, listens to his dad and gets to work trying to make an offering. But what happens?
And when the idol did not eat it, he ordered a still finer meal offering to be prepared and offered it to the idol.
Okay, so it doesn't eat the first offering. So he figures, well, maybe it wasn't good enough, right? So he makes a better offering, and the idol still doesn't eat. Keep going.
But the idol did neither eat nor answer when addressed by him. And so Abraham grew angry, and kindling a fire, burned them all.
So he burns up all the idols because he's angry at them.
When Terah, on coming home, found his idols burnt, he went to Abraham and said, "Who has burned my gods?" Abraham replied, "The large one quarreled with his little ones and burned them in his anger." "Fool that you are, how canst you say that he who cannot see, nor hear, nor walk, should have done this?" Then Abraham said, "How then can you forsake the living God and serve gods that neither see nor hear?"
Yeah, those 3-year-olds. Feisty little bunch, aren't they? So what's his point? To me, in more modern English,
That cannot be God.
if they can't do anything, they can't be God. They didn't eat the offering that you offered for them. They didn't, talk to me when I tried to talk to them. So they must not be God. Those sacrifices that we offered, did God eat them? I mean, there was no idol in the temple or the Mishkan, or the tabernacle. But did God eat those sacrifices?
Gave them to the priests.
Mostly they were eaten by people. Exactly, either by the person who brought them or by the priests. A few of them were burnt in their entirety. But yes, that we didn't see God ever eating them. And there was never a belief in Judaism that God would eat them. And so eventually we'll have to explain, probably not today, how Judaism understands sacrifices in a different manner than what the idolaters did, or else we might be susceptible to the same criticism. But suffice it to say, for the moment, he saw the idols as being completely impotent pieces of wood, or stone, or metal. And that was enough for him to say, these can't be that which made everything that I've seen in this world. Make sense? Okay, let's try version 2 of the idol story. This one might be more familiar. Question first, or are you volunteering to
One
read?
comment on being 3 years old.
Yeah.
We were watching a program, and they showed this 7-year-old girl who
Mhm.
started playing the piano with 3.
Wow.
And at 7, she wrote a whole opera. So you can't, and I think Mozart that started.
Oh, Mozart started
playing
very young
3.
as well. Exactly. Exactly.
So, yeah, we can't cross that
Oh,
off.
absolutely not. And the idea that if anybody was going to be picked to be the founder of this new covenant, it would be someone who was a spiritual prodigy. Makes a lot of sense. So making him 3 years old is not so far-fetched. On the other hand, it could also be simply saying even a 3-year-old can figure out that idolatry is stupid, which may be another dig at those who worshipped idols.
It's kind of the story of the king's new clothes.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. All right. Who'd like to read version number 2 of the idol story? This is the one that probably you're more familiar with. Don't all volunteer at once. Please.
Rabhaya said, Terah was a manufacturer of idols.
So, now rather than just being a man who owned idols, in this version, Terach actually makes them. That's his job.
He once went away somewhere and left Abraham to sell them in his place. A man came and wished to buy one. How old are you, Abraham? Asked him. 50 years was the reply. Woe to such a man, he exclaimed. You are 50 years old and you worship a day-old object. At this he became ashamed and departed.
Like, what were you, born yesterday? Because this idol was, I just finished making this yesterday in the back of the shop, and you're going to come and worship it? Please, which one of you is more venerable? This one's still warm off the mold. How can you worship this thing? Make sense? Not very good sales tactics, but
Wasn't a good businessman.
it wasn't a good businessman. Well, it depends on what he was trying to sell. But he certainly wasn't good at selling idols. Now, the fact that we're making Terach into the manufacturer of idols, you might think, oh, well, it's even more impressive that Abraham would come from an idol-making family to eventually discover God and reject idolatry. But I personally believe that the reason the Midrashim put him in the midst of this is so that he would know exactly what went into making an idol and see them for what they were, just raw materials. It's sort of like if you told me that somebody who grew up working in a sausage factory decided to become a vegetarian, I wouldn't be surprised. Because if you see what goes into making sausages, you're probably going to be a little put off of meat. Similarly, if you see what goes into making an idol, they lose their mystique. They lose their majesty and mystery. And it's just a lump of wood, or it's just a lump of clay or metal. All right, keep going.
On another occasion, a woman came with a plate full of flour and requested him, "Take this and offer it to them." So he took a stick, broke them, and put the stick in the hand of the largest. When his father returned, he demanded, "What have you done to them? I cannot conceal it from you," he rejoined.
This is his George Washington moment from the cherry tree.
A woman came with a plate full of fine meal and requested me to offer it to them. One claimed I must eat first, while another claimed I must eat first. Thereupon the largest arose, took the stick, and broke it. Why do you make a sport of me?" he cried out. "Have they then any knowledge? Should not your ears listen to what your mouth is saying?" Abraham told him.
So Abraham makes a little play here. You know, he smashes them all, puts the stick in the biggest hands, and says, well, they got into an argument about who was going to eat. And the biggest one won. And we, as the reader, know that that's ridiculous, and by extension, an idolater should understand how ridiculous their idolatry is. Does that make sense? Maybe? Okay, we're going to go back a little bit more once we've gotten the rest of the Midrashim under our belt to understand that these are not just fairy tales, and that these shouldn't be taken just as simplistic portrayals of idolatry. You know, it's very easy to say, well, come on. Your average idolater didn't believe the idol ate food any more than we believe God ate our sacrifices. And the average idolater wouldn't have expected the idol to be God. They saw it as a manifestation, as a conduit, as a representation of there's all sorts of more sophisticated language they would use. Nevertheless, the criticisms that are being leveled here by the Midrashim and portrayed and acted out by Abraham are still perfectly valid, but we'll get to that near the end. All right, keep going.
Okay. Terah was angry and handed him over to Nimrod.
So, notice the difference from our earlier Midrash, our earlier Agadah, earlier tale, where Terach defended his son against Nimrod by hiding him in a cave. Here, we have Terach handing him over to Nimrod after his son becomes uncontrollable in the idol shop. What's that?
I can't do anything with this kid.
I can't do anything with this kid. You take it.
Nimrod suggested to Abraham that since he had refused to worship his father's idols because of their want of power, he should worship fire, which was very powerful.
Makes a lot of sense, right? Okay, fine. This kid is not your little pushover. He wants a God with power. Fine. Worship fire.
Abraham pointed out that water has power over fire. Well, said Nimrod, let us declare water God. But replied Abraham, the clouds absorb the water, and even they are dispersed by the wind. Then let us declare the wind our God. Bear in mind, continued Abraham, that man is stronger than wind and can resist it and stand against it.
All right, and Nimrod's going to get a little angry with this smart aleck in a second. Remember, this Midrash doesn't say he's 3, but he's certainly young enough to be mocking his elders. This exchange here is very, very telling of what the rabbis, the sages, were trying to do with these Midrashim. When he says fire is more powerful than these clay statues, but water is more powerful than fire, no, but the wind can disperse the clouds. But who can stand against the wind?
Man.
So ultimately, if you are trying to seek the supreme source of material power to be the object of your worship, where does Abraham say you end? With man. And the great flaw of idolatry that the rabbis are trying to point out through the vehicle of Abraham's stories is that idolatry is ultimately about the idolatry of man. Not of statues or paintings or pictures or fire or the sun in the sky or whatever. But ultimately it is about man being the object of veneration. Through the trappings of idolatry and worship of these statues, idols, and sun and stars. But ultimately it's about putting man at the pinnacle of power. And Abraham doesn't buy it, and Nimrod doesn't like having that pointed out. Of course, after all, Nimrod was the man at the top of the power pyramid at the time. So of course, he doesn't want that pointed out. Okay? Maybe? All right. So,
Okay. Nimrod, becoming weary of arguing with Abraham, decided to cast him before his God, fire, and challenged Abraham's deliverance by the God of Abraham. But God saved him out of the fiery furnace. Haran, too, was
which remember was one of Abraham's brothers.
Haran, too, was challenged to declare his God, but halted between two opinions and delayed his answer until he saw the result of Abraham's faith.
All right, so we're portraying now Nimrod's like, fine, you know what? I worship fire. You say your God's better. We'll chuck you in the fire and see whose God wins. Not exactly what we would normally call a fair test, but no one said Nimrod was fair. So Abraham gets chucked into the furnace to get burnt up. At that point, his brother Haran has also been told, you tell me who your God is. Is your God our God, the idols, fire, etc.? Or is your God this God that Abraham's talking about? And Haran, he's waiting to see the outcome of Abraham, whether he comes out, fully baked or whether he comes out okay. Of course, he's going to come out okay.
When he saw the latter saved,
he
he declared himself on the side of Abraham's God.
I want his God.
Thinking that he too, having now become an adherent of that God, would be saved by the same miracle. But since his faith was not real, but depended on a miracle, he perished in the fire, into which, like Abraham, he was cast by Nimrod. This is hinted in the words in Genesis 11:28. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of Chaldea.
Nativity just meaning the place of his birth. In case we have any misunderstandings about what nativity means. It's the land that you are a native of. That's what nativity comes from. All right, so Michael asked about hooks. The hook is from the very end of Parashat Noah, the part that we began by reading, which says that Harach died in the land of Ur-Kasdim in front of his father. And they say, well, what does that mean? Well, Ur-Kasdim can mean the land of the fiery furnace as well. So we'll say that there was a furnace there and that he died because he didn't have the same type of faith that Abraham had. So it's a bit of a stretch, I understand. But that's the linguistic hook that they are hanging this on. They're saying they wouldn't bother to tell us that Haran died unless it was important. Therefore, what was the importance? It was showing us that a faith that is based only upon the validation of a miracle isn't faith, and people like that don't get saved from furnaces.
How did Abraham get out of the fire?
God,
He just took him out.
just as he got protected. So maybe he just let himself out. Okay? All right. Who would have liked to have had all of these stories, or even just a shorter version of these stories, in the Torah? Who would feel better if these were all in the Torah? We've got at least one honest hand. Wouldn't you like to have some explanation of why Abraham was chosen in the Torah? I would have. It would have been nice.
God didn't write these words.
Well, God didn't write these words, but presumably there was some reason for picking Abraham. Even if the Midrashim were wrong, and I'm not saying they are wrong, but even if they weren't, even if they were just complete random attempts to figure out what had made God choose Abraham, there was somewhere a real reason that made God pick Abraham. I would have liked to have heard God's reason for picking Abraham, but God chose not to include it.
If it was laid out word for word,
Mhm.
then we would try to copy it.
Good. I mean, think if it said, God chose Abraham because he was a man that recognized the faith on his own, that came to God in his youth, that was able to stand against the idolatry of his age. I mean, those are all good things. We should try to do the same.
But to have a little formula written, then we'll go to the formula.
I mean, you could argue the whole Torah is a formula.
And it would,
Want to have a good life? Do what the Torah says, and you'll have a good life.
but it has to be done as an individual.
Has to be done as an individual. So says the modern. But I would like to propose, if I may, that we get a different eraser. I would like to propose, if I can erase anything, that at least one reason why we don't hear in the Torah itself the backstory to Abraham, why everything in front of Abraham, earlier in time, is completely immaterial, is because to the people who received Torah, the generations at Sinai, and all the subsequent generations throughout the early days of Israel's history, didn't care. What mattered to them was they were a nation. What mattered to them was their nation came from this guy, and what mattered to them is that God had made a promise to this guy. Didn't matter why God had made that promise. Didn't matter where this guy had even come from. They were living in this land because of that promise, and they were living a certain life because of the reciprocity of that promise and the confirmation that came at Sinai, and everything behind that didn't matter. It'd be like you waking up one day when you're, a youngster and saying, you know what? Why is my last name X, Y, and Z? You know what? I didn't pick that name for myself. I'm going to go change my name. How many of you have ever considered changing your citizenship? Just picking up and leaving the country. Probably doesn't occur to us that often. And it wouldn't have occurred to our ancestors very often. The Torah wasn't trying to explain why Abraham sided with God. It was trying to explain what it mattered to me that Abraham had sided with God. And what mattered to me was that because of that, there's a covenant that led to the establishment of Israel, which led to the establishment of Torah, technically Torah first, and led to me living where I am now in my way. And everything prior to that just wasn't that important. Does that make sense? Well, if that's true, and like I said, that's my opinion, but if that's true, why did the rabbis, during the time of Midrashim and later, spend so much time trying to uncover this great blank space? Trying to fill in all of that. Shouldn't they have just said, hey, I don't know why God picked Abraham. I frankly don't care. I'm not interested in that. All that I'm interested in is fulfilling the terms of the covenant that has come since. And God had his reasons. Maybe he picked Abraham's name out of a hat. Maybe he didn't. Maybe Abraham earned it. Maybe he didn't. What matters is God called, Abraham answered, the covenant was made, we are a Jewish people, that's it. Why spend all of this time coming up with other ideas? Well, in their day, like ours, not everyone, in fact, the vast majority, don't take our faith and our understanding of God as a given. Most of us do not start off like 3-year-old Abraham walking outside the cave and going, wow, there's got to be a God. Oh, that's it. We don't respond to the awe and the majesty and beauty and immensity of the universe automatically like that. We have to be taught. And in their day, and even more in ours, that is to say the days of the sages, people were less and less inclined to simply accept what their parents told them, mimicking in many ways the activities of young Abraham, who argued with his dad, argued with the elders, argued with the king. Well, they were arguing, that is to say, many of our ancestors and many people today, against Judaism. Well, how do I know that this is really what God wants me to do? How do I know that there is a God? Prove to me there's a God. Prove to me I shouldn't just, worship some other religion. And what are they trying to establish here? You can come to a belief in God just on your own. They're not saying you should. They're not saying that you should start off by rejecting everything that our tradition has given us as an advantage. But they are saying, look, even somebody who doesn't have the benefit of, for their case, 2,000, or our case, it's 3,000 or almost 4,000 years of Jewish teaching, can recognize there is a God if they just open their eyes and use their brain. Even somebody who doesn't have the benefits of tradition can recognize that idolatry is stupid if they just use their brain. Fine. You don't want to accept it from me? says the Midrash. Accept it the same way Abraham did, which was on his own terms, coming to the same conclusions I want you to come to. Just use your brain. This is the ultimate vindication that a rational person will be faithful, not that reason and faith are at opposite odds. This is the ultimate goal, that you shouldn't be afraid of reason. That reason only leads you closer to God if you use it. And so the Midrashim are there to try and give us that hint, that leg up, that example, that you shouldn't be afraid of reason. And in fact, those who reject religion because they don't like the idea of just accepting things on faith should be encouraged to use reason the same way Abraham did, to reach faith through that road, even if they won't accept it from us in tradition. Does that make sense? Okay. The best little summary of that is at the bottom point, and we're just about out of time. You can read the example there of Abraham seeing the palace on fire and believing that therefore there are things going on. But at the very bottom, it says from Rambam, after this prodigious child was weaned, he began to muse while he was still young, and started to ponder by day and by night, and would question how it was possible for the earth to continue to revolve without a guide. And he had no mentor, right? Nobody else around is doing these sorts of things, nor did anyone reveal anything to him, but he was immersed in Ur-Kasdim among foolish idolaters. His father and mother and all of the people served idols, and he would serve with them, while his heart pondered and mused, until he understood the path of truth and realized the line of justice by virtue of his own correct reasoning. Then he came to understand that there was only one God, and that he was the guide of the celestial wheel. He created everything, and there is no God among all of creation other than him. Left to our own devices, if we really put our mind to it and ask ourselves the right questions, we will find God. But just copying others and not thinking about it, we will remain ignorant of God. Now, the rabbis meant that mostly for the benefit of those who were straying from the path of Judaism, but even for those of us here who were clearly taking an interest in trying to learn more, must remember that you have to stretch out your mind and think about God to have the connection to God. Just doing what's done because that's what's done is the foundation, but you have to reach out and think about it more if you want the ultimate experience of connection. Okay? Okay. Hearing no objections, so moved. See you all on Shabbat. Take care.